Over in the UK, they've got a serious problem with racism, and it raises a question that I've sort of struggled with on this program in the past, and somewhat in my writing, in my book Threshold, for example, The Crisis of Western Civilization, and that is it possible? And I believe it is. I'll just put this right up front, and in fact, I think we're 3/4 of the way there. But is it possible to have a democratic society, small d democratic society, that is genuinely multiracial, that doesn't devolve into essentially a caste system? I realize that there are, probably Brazil is the most multiracial democracy in the world, given the demographics of Brazil. The whites are a substantial minority in that country. But that said, there's, having been there, I can tell you there is still a racial hierarchy in Brazil, and most of the power, both economic and political, in that country is concentrated in the hands of people who are descended from white Spaniards. And the lighter the skin in Brazil, generally speaking, the more political and economic power you have, and the darker your skin, generally speaking, the less. And we find that to be true in the United States. You find that true in many countries around the world. And this is an issue that I don't think that we have come up with a solution for yet. I mean, obviously an awful lot of this is just leftover doctrine of discovery, between the Catholics and the European conquistadors for all the various countries. These ideas of white supremacy are just kind of baked into many of these cultures, including our own. And I think confronting that legacy, that toxicity, is kind of step one. And one of the things we're seeing right now, Sweden and Germany are looking at, shedding some of their brown-skinned immigrants, the non-Christian immigrants. This isn't just about necessarily race. I mean, you look at the history of Northern Ireland versus Ireland, and you can see it can be about a religion too, or about national origin. I mean, the Orangemen, the people of Northern Ireland, you've got, basically this battle between, the indigenous loyalist Catholic, or the indigenous Catholics, and those who are the loyalists, who are still, descendant of British overlords and still loyal to Great Britain. And they're willing to kill each other over it. So, this tribalism is like deeply baked into us. And so all that, I lay out all that premise by way of saying that whenever any other country points to the United States and says, oh, we have a race problem because of you, or because of America, I think we need to view it skeptically. This is on the one hand, a human nature problem, and on the other hand, an all of society problem. But now the minister Angela, I'm not sure how it's pronounced. I'm guessing Angela, actually, in England. Angela Eagle is the British minister in charge of irregular migration. It would be like, what you would call illegal immigration here in the United States. She said that Donald Trump has helped create, quote, vitriol against migrants through social media, and that is what is cranking up the anti-immigrant hate and just naked racism that the UK has been experiencing in large quantities recently. The overt, her phrase, overt racism that is spilled out onto British streets. She said that, this is a quote from The Guardian, she said, unnamed right-wing Tories, that's the Conservatives in the UK, had used language that had given a yellow flashing light to racists, using a toxic discourse as they fought off the challenge from the Reform Party. In other words, the British Conservatives are using racism the same way that American conservatives and Republicans have been using racism since Nixon's Southern strategy. Nixon did it with his Southern strategy, talking about his all-white silent majority. And then you had Reagan, of course, using it explicitly. I mean, the very first speech Reagan gave after he was nominated at the Republican convention, he went down to Philadelphia, Mississippi, to this little town, to the Neshoba County Fair, to give a speech to an all-white audience about states' rights, which what they were referring to in 1980 when they said states' rights was the right to prevent black children from going to schools with white children specifically. And he chose a location that was just a couple miles down the road from where Messrs. Schwimmer, Cheney, and Goodman were murdered, the three civil rights workers who were murdered that they made the movie Mississippi Burning out of. I mean, Reagan and his campaign chose that site for the first speech of his election. And then, you know, he went around giving speeches in which he would talk about, doesn't it upset you when that young buck standing in front of you in the grocery store is using his food stamps to buy steak and champagne when you're barely scraping by? And we all know what he meant. You know, his welfare queen in New York City that literally did not exist. The New York Times spent years looking for her. She doesn't exist. But, you know, a black lady driving a Cadillac. I mean, you know, Reagan was like all in on the stereotypes. And then, of course, you had George W. Bush. He wasn't so much going after black people. He was a little more tolerant there. But, you know, Katie bar the door, you know, when it comes to Muslims. He gave some good lip service to, you know, we need to, but look at what he did in Gitmo. Look at what he did in Iraq and Afghanistan. And then, you know, Trump comes along and starts picking on Mexicans. And, you know, oh my God, these Hispanic people, you know, they're murderous and they're rapists and whatnot. So we have this long history, or at least the Republican Party has this long history in the United States, a 60-year history of using racism, not just race, but racism, hatred of race, hatred of a specific race, as a political weapon. Well, this is now starting to happen in the United Kingdom. And, you know, I get it that Donald Trump has given license to a lot of this stuff. I think Trump's presidency and Trump's rhetoric has helped the AfD party, the Alternative for Deutschland, the new neo-Nazi party in the UK, in Germany. I think he has helped Giorgia Meloni, the neo-fascist leader of Italy and her party, the fascist, you know, I forget the name of the party, but it's basically the reinvention of Mussolini's party, toned down slightly. You've got an openly white supremacist party in Sweden that is doing very well right now. You've got a huge openly white supremacist party in Austria that is doing very well. I mean, this is happening all over Europe. And I do believe, I think that she's right. You know, this member of parliament who's saying that, you know, Trump is causing an awful lot of this. I think there's some truth to that. But I also think that Putin just, you know, was brilliant when he just bombed the crap out of Syria in order to, you know, when Assad was being challenged during the Arab Spring back in 2011, 2012, and the years immediately after that. When Assad was being challenged, Putin wanted to protect his deep water ports, you know, off Damascus. It was basically his African base. And so he had to keep Bashir in power in Syria. And so he bombed Aleppo back to the Stone Age and bombed a third of Damascus into rubble. And what did that do? It produced, you know, 6 million Syrian refugees. And where did they go? They went to Europe. They fled north, along with the Libyan refugees following our murder of Gaddafi, and you know, and refugees from other countries in the region as the Arab Spring was really cranking up. And so all of these people flooding into Europe, then that was used by Viktor Orban for his political purposes. You know, his slogans when he was running were build a wall and make Hungary great again. And he did build a wall along Hungary's southern border, and he has been keeping Syrians out of Hungary. And, you know, other countries are looking at the crisis associated with this. You can absorb, you know, people who are different than you, culturally, racially, whatever it may be, you know, over time without a problem. But it has to be relatively gradual. So I think, you know, part of it is just, you know, the radical demographic shift, or sudden shock rather, that was inflicted on Europe by Putin's attacking Syria back, you know, a decade ago. And and to this day, you've got refugees now coming by boat into the UK, and they're struggling with what to do about it. So that's part of it. Another part of it is that there is now a worldwide refugee crisis. I mean, this is what's happening in our southern border. You got parts of Guatemala and Honduras and El Salvador that have been taken over by gangs, in large part because the Reagan administration destabilized all four of those democracies. You've got Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador. It's one other country down there. Anyway, and this is the result of climate change. And now we're seeing people literally on the move all over the world because climate change is rendering their environments inhospitable. So, there's a much larger issue here, and I have no glib or easy answers for it. But to reduce it down to this, it's all Donald Trump's fault, which I'm happy to say, but it's not true. He's just riding the wave. But the point, I think the big point that I want to make here is that it's going to get worse. The pressure of refugees, there's 6 billion or 8 billion people on the planet now. And global warming making the planet less and less hospitable, and sea level rises that are I mean, we're already up, what, 5-6 inches now over the last century, where these sea level rises are increasingly going to start hitting the point where they're making our cities on the coast, and that's where the majority of the human population lives worldwide, that they're making cities along the coasts uninhabitable. And when that happens, you're going to see major flows of refugees. So anyhow, I started out just with this little story about the British blaming Trump for racism in Great Britain, but I really do think that there are much larger issues at stake here, and if any of you have deep thoughts on this or suggestions or ideas or solutions, I'd love to hear them. I really would. 18 minutes past the hour. I'll pick up your calls on the other side of the break.